In the summer of 1212, the Caliph of Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with the largest Muslim army Spain had ever seen. He came to finish what his predecessors had started, to sweep the Christian kingdoms into the sea and reclaim all of Iberia for Islam. Blocking his path stood a coalition of Christian kings who had spent generations fighting each other. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped behind a mountain wall with no way forward. And then a shepherd appeared. He led them through a secret pass, down onto a sun-baked plain, and into the heart of the enemy camp. By sunset, the ground was covered in the dead. An empire had shattered, and Muslim Spain began its slow, irreversible collapse. A collapse that would end only with Granada's fall 280 years later. In the summer of 1195, a young king named Alfonso VIII rode south from Toledo with the full strength of Castile at his back, and in his heart burned the certainty that he would crush the Almohad invaders and drive them back across the sea. He was 40 years old, but he had been king since childhood, and he had never truly known defeat, and so when he reached the plains near Alarcos on the river Guadiana, he did not wait for his allies to arrive. The king of Leon had promised soldiers, but Leon and Castile had quarrelled for generations, and perhaps Alfonso did not trust him, or perhaps he simply could not bear to share the glory. The king of Navarre was marching south but moving slowly, and Alfonso grew impatient. The Almohad Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur had crossed from Africa with an army that seemed to stretch to the horizon, and Alfonso believed that speed and courage would overcome numbers. He was wrong. The battle began on a blisteringly hot July afternoon, and within hours the Castilian army was surrounded. The Almohad cavalry swept around both flanks while their infantry held the centre, and the Christian knights found themselves fighting in every direction at once. Men fell screaming into the dust. Horses collapsed beneath their riders. The royal banner wavered and nearly fell. By nightfall, the army of Castile had been annihilated, and Alfonso himself had to be dragged from the field by his surviving knights, who begged him to flee before the Caliph's men found him. He escaped with perhaps 20 men out of thousands. He rode through the darkness toward Toledo, and behind him the Almohads celebrated a victory so complete that they renamed themselves Al-Mansur, the victorious. For Alfonso, the nightmare had only begun. In the weeks and months that followed, the Almohads advanced almost unopposed. Trujillo fell. Plasencia fell. Talavera and Cuenca and a dozen other fortresses surrendered or were taken by storm. The frontier that Alfonso had spent years pushing southward now collapsed backward until the enemy camped in the hills just beyond Toledo itself. The ancient capital of the Visigoths, the spiritual heart of Christian Spain, lay within sight of Muslim scouts. And through all of this, Alfonso lived with the knowledge that he had done this to himself. He had been arrogant. He had been impatient. He had thrown away an army and nearly lost a kingdom because he could not wait, could not trust, could not see past his own pride. The shame of Alarcos became a wound that never healed. For 17 years, Alfonso rebuilt. He made peace with Leon. He negotiated with Navarre. He strengthened his castles and trained new soldiers and watched the border with patient, burning eyes. He never forgot the screaming of his dying men. He never forgot the thunder of Almohad drums. And he never stopped preparing for the day when he would have another chance. That day came in 1211 when a new caliph crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. Muhammad al-Nasir was the son of the man who had humiliated Alfonso at Alarcos, and he came with an army even larger than his father's. His first target was Salvatierra Castle, the headquarters of the Knights of Calatrava, a fortress embedded deep in Muslim territory that had stood as a symbol of Christian defiance for years. The Caliph besieged it and took it, and Alfonso understood exactly what this meant. It was not merely a military operation, it was a message. The son had come to finish what the father had started. The Almohads wanted Castile. They wanted Toledo. They wanted all of Spain. Alfonso was 60 years old now, and he had waited 17 years for this moment. He sent messengers north to Aragon and Navarre. He sent ambassadors to Rome. He gathered his nobles and his bishops, and he told them what he had known since the day he fled Alarcos in the darkness. This time he would not fight alone. This time he would bring every Christian sword in Spain against the Caliph. And this time he would win or he would die. Alfonso chose his messenger carefully. Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada of Toledo was a man of learning and fire, a scholar who could speak to kings and popes with equal authority, and Alfonso sent him north across the Pyrenees with a single mission. Go to Rome, tell the Pope what is coming, beg him to call all of Christendom to our aid. The Archbishop travelled through the summer and autumn of 1211, and when he reached Pope Innocent III, he spoke of the Almohad host gathering in Africa, of the fall of Salvatierra, of the threat not just to Castile, but to all of Christian Europe. The Pope listened and he understood. In the winter of 1211, Innocent III issued a papal bull declaring a holy crusade against the Almohads of Spain, and he promised indulgences to any knight who would take up arms in the name of Christ. Word spread across the continent like fire through dry grass. In France and Germany and Italy, men heard that a great battle was coming in Spain, and thousands answered the call. By the spring of 1212, an army unlike any Spain had seen before began to gather in Toledo. The estimates vary wildly because medieval chroniclers loved to exaggerate, but the host that assembled in that ancient city may have numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 130,000 men, depending on which source you trust. What matters is that it was enormous and that it came from everywhere. French knights rode through the mountain passes. German crusaders made the long journey south. The military orders sent their finest warriors. And most remarkably, of all three kings who had spent decades fighting each other now stood together in the same city preparing to march against a common enemy. Alfonso VIII of Castile was the architect of this alliance, but the men who joined him had every reason to hate him. Pedro II of Aragon had quarrelled with Castile over border territories for years, and the two kingdoms had nearly gone to war more than once. 7th Sancho of Navarre nursed even deeper grievances. Alfonso had stripped Navarre of several provinces while Sancho was away, and Sancho had been so furious that he had actually travelled to Africa and offered his services to the Almohads themselves. He had campaigned alongside the Muslims against his fellow Christians. Yet here he was in Toledo, ready to fight beside the man who had wronged him, because whatever hatred these kings held for each other paled against the hatred they all felt for the invaders from Africa. The army marched south on June 21st, 1212, and at first everything went well. They captured Malagon within days. They retook Calatrava, the great fortress of the military orders that had fallen to the Almohads the year before. The Spanish soldiers moved with purpose and discipline, but the foreign crusaders grew restless. The heat of the Spanish summer was brutal, far worse than anything the French and German knights had experienced in their homelands. The terrain was hostile and water was scarce. And then came the question of prisoners. When Muslim defenders surrendered, Alfonso allowed them to leave in peace. He had lived on this frontier his entire life, and he understood that mercy today might mean allies tomorrow. The French crusaders saw only weakness. They wanted blood. They wanted plunder. They wanted the glory of slaughter, and when Alfonso denied them, they began to leave. One by one, the foreign contingents packed their belongings and marched back north through the mountain passes. 30,000 crusaders or thereabouts had come from beyond the Pyrenees, and nearly all of them abandoned the campaign before the real fighting began. Alfonso watched them go with cold eyes. He had expected this. He had hoped for better, but he had prepared for worse. And then Sancho VII of Navarre arrived with his Navarrese warriors, men who knew this land and this enemy, men who would not flinch from heat or hardship. The army that remained was smaller than before, but it was purely Spanish now. Castilians and Aragonese and Navarrese and Portuguese volunteers and the knights of the military orders. This would be their fight. Spain would decide its own fate. In early July, the Christian army reached the Sierra Morena and stopped. This mountain range stretched for nearly 500 kilometers across the heart of Spain like a wall built by God himself to divide the Christian north from the Muslim south. The peaks rose jagged and forbidding against the summer sky, and the valleys between them were narrow and treacherous, and the only known passage through this barrier was a gorge called La Losa near Puerto del Muradal. Alfonso sent scouts ahead, and they returned with grim news. The Almohads had fortified the pass. Thousands of soldiers waited in the narrow defile with archers positioned on the heights above, and the Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir had made his camp on the southern plain with the full strength of his army spread across the land like a dark tide. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If the Christians marched through La Losa, they would be funneled into a killing ground where their numbers meant nothing, and the enemy arrows would fall on them like rain. 1,000 men could hold that pass against the greatest army on earth. But if the Christians turned back, then everything was lost. The Almohads would sweep north through an undefended Castile, and Toledo would fall, and after Toledo there would be nothing to stop them from reaching the Pyrenees. Alfonso gathered his kings and his generals, and they stared at the mountains and saw no way forward. The army camped at the foot of the Sierra Morena, and a kind of despair began to settle over the soldiers who had marched so far only to find themselves trapped. And then a man appeared in the Christian camp. His name was Martin al-Hajja, and some chronicles say he was a shepherd who knew these mountains the way a man knows his own hands. Others say he was a hunter who had wandered these trails all his life. Still others, writing years later, claimed he was no ordinary man at all, but Saint Isidore himself, sent by God to deliver the faithful from destruction. Whatever he was, he came to the kings with a simple message. There is another way. He told them of a hidden path through the mountains, a narrow gorge that wound through the peaks far from the fortified pass, a route the Almohads did not know and had not guarded. The kings listened, and they had no choice but to believe him, because the alternative was death or retreat. On the night of July 13th, the Christian army began to move. They marched in darkness through terrain so difficult that the columns stretched for miles, with men picking their way single file along cliff edges and through ravines where a single misstep meant death. Thousands of soldiers and horses and supply wagons crept through the black night in near silence because any sound might carry to Almohad sentries on distant ridges. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, and then, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the lead elements of the army emerged onto a high plateau that would forever after be known as Mesa del Rey, the Table of the King. The men looked south, and they saw the Almohad camp spread across the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa below them. The enemy host was vast beyond counting, tents and banners and cooking fires stretching to the horizon, but the Caliph had been outmaneuvered. He had fortified a pass the Christians would never use. Now they stood on the heights above him, and for the first time since Alarcos, Alfonso VIII allowed himself to hope. King Alfonso rewarded Martin al-Hajja for his service by granting him a new name. Because the shepherd had marked the secret path with the skull of a cow, he and all his descendants would be known as Cabeza de Vaca, the head of the cow, and centuries later, one of those descendants would survive a shipwreck in the New World and walk across an unknown continent, and his name would be Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. In the grey light before dawn on July 16th, the Christian army formed its lines on the slopes above the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa. The three kings had divided their forces into three great columns, with Alfonso VIII commanding the centre, flanked by Pedro II of Aragon on the left and Sancho VII of Navarre on the right. Before them in the vanguard rode the knights of the military orders, the black-robed warriors of Calatrava who had lost their fortress to the Almohads and burned for vengeance. The Red-Crossed Knights of Santiago, whose very purpose was war against the Moors, the Templars and Hospitallers who had travelled from the Holy Land itself to fight in this Spanish crusade. Behind them, rank upon rank of armoured cavalry and infantry stretched back across the plateau, tens of thousands of men who had marched through the summer heat and climbed through the mountains in darkness and now stood ready to decide the fate of their kingdoms with blood and iron. Below on the plain, the Almohad army was already stirring. The drums began first, a deep rhythmic thunder that rolled across the valley and shook the air itself, and then came the horns and the chanting and the endless movement of men preparing for war. The Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir had arranged his host in layers, wave after wave of soldiers stretching back towards the horizon, light cavalry on the flanks and massed infantry in the centre, and behind them all his personal guard surrounding the great red tent where the banner of the Almohads flew against the morning sky. The first charge came from the Christians. Diego López de Haro, the Lord of Vizcaya and the most experienced warrior in Castile, led the vanguard down the slope at a gallop with the knights of the military orders thundering beside him. They crashed into the Almohad lines with a sound like the world breaking apart, lances shattering against shields and bodies, horses screaming, men dying in the first seconds of impact. And then the real killing began. The Latin Chronicle would later record that they attacked one another hand to hand with lances and swords and battle axes, and there was no room for archers, and the Christians pressed on. The fighting was so close and so brutal that men could smell the breath of the enemies they killed. For hours, the battle ground forward with neither side able to break the other. López de Haro drove his knights deeper into the Almohad ranks, but for every enemy they cut down, another seemed to take his place. The sun rose higher, and the heat became savage, and men fought in their armour until they could barely lift their arms. By midday, the Christian advance had stalled. The Almohad light cavalry began to sweep around the flanks, threatening to encircle the exhausted crusaders, and López de Haro's vanguard found itself nearly surrounded and taking casualties it could not afford. The battle hung by a thread. From his position on the high ground, Alfonso VIII watched the carnage below and understood that the moment of decision had come. If the vanguard broke, the army would shatter and Castile would die on this field, just as it had nearly died at Alarcos 17 years before. He turned to the kings beside him and spoke words that no chronicle recorded, but every man who survived that day remembered. It was time. The three kings put themselves at the head of the heavy cavalry reserve. Alfonso VIII of Castile and Pedro II of Aragon and Sancho VII of Navarre, the rulers of three kingdoms that had fought each other for generations, now formed a single wedge of armoured fury pointed at the heart of the enemy army. This was not tactics. This was something older and more desperate, a willingness to die that transformed men into something more than men. They charged. The heavy cavalry of three kingdoms swept down the slope in a wave of steel and horseflesh that struck the Almohad centre with the force of an avalanche. The Knights of Santiago were the first to break through, tearing gaps in the enemy line that the following ranks poured into like water through a shattered dam. The Almohad formations began to buckle, and then Sancho VII of Navarre saw the Caliph's tent. Muhammad al-Nasir had surrounded himself with his personal guard, elite African warriors who, according to legend, were chained together so they could not flee, though later historians would suggest this was a mistranslation of a word meaning serried or tightly packed. Whatever the truth of their chains, these men stood like a human wall around their lord, the last defence between the Caliph and the Christian knights who were cutting their way toward him. Sancho VII was a giant of a man, famous across Spain for his strength, and he led his Navarrese directly at the Black Guards. The impact was terrible. Men died screaming as Sancho and his warriors hacked through the defensive ring, breaking bodies and breaking chains, if chains there were. And the guards fell one by one until there was nothing between the Christians and the Caliph's tent. Muhammad al-Nasir fled. He ran from his own camp with his bodyguard shattered and his army watching. And in that moment, the battle ended. An army can survive terrible losses, but it cannot survive the sight of its leader running for his life. The Almohad host broke and ran. What had been a vast and disciplined military machine became a panicked mob fleeing south toward the mountains, and the Christians pursued them without mercy. The cavalry rode down the fleeing soldiers for miles, killing until their arms were too tired to swing their swords, and when the sun finally set, the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa was carpeted with the dead. Contemporary sources claim that 100,000 Almohads died that day, though modern historians suspect this number is greatly exaggerated. What is certain is that the Christian losses were astonishingly small, perhaps 2,000 men, and when Alfonso VIII wrote to Pope Innocent III describing the victory, he noted that his army had camped in the enemy camp for 2 days, and for all the fires they needed to cook their food, they used no other wood than the arrows and spears of their enemies that lay scattered across the battlefield, and even then they burned scarcely half of them. Sancho VII of Navarre took the chains from the Caliph's guard as a trophy, and from that day forward the Kingdom of Navarre bore a new coat of arms, golden chains on a field of red with an emerald at the centre, a symbol that can still be seen on the flag of Spain today. The Christian army did not leave the battlefield immediately. For 3 days they camped among the dead, resting in the captured tents of the Almohads, eating the food their enemies had prepared, tending to their wounded, while burial parties worked to clear the ground of corpses. The scale of the victory was almost impossible to comprehend. Arrows and spears lay so thick upon the earth that the soldiers gathered them by the cartload and used them for firewood, and even after 3 days of burning they had scarcely made a dent in the piles of abandoned weapons. Alfonso ordered the Caliph's tent and personal standard packed carefully and sent north across the Pyrenees as a gift for Pope Innocent III, proof that the crusade he had proclaimed had ended in triumph beyond anyone's expectations. Then the army moved south. The fortified cities of Baeza and Ubeda stood in their path, the last significant defences before the rich lands of Andalusia, and the garrisons had been weakened by the catastrophe at Las Navas de Tolosa. Baeza fell quickly, its defenders fleeing before the Christian advance, and tens of thousands of refugees flooded into Ubeda, hoping to find safety behind its walls. They found only death. Alfonso besieged the city, and when it fell, his soldiers killed and enslaved the population without mercy. Contemporary chronicles speak of 60,000 dead or captured, though the true numbers are impossible to verify. The war that had begun as a desperate defense had become a conquest. Far to the south, Muhammad al-Nasir was running for his life. The Caliph, who had crossed the strait with the largest army Africa had ever sent to Spain, retreated through the wreckage of his ambitions until he reached Marrakesh, the heart of the Almohad Empire, and there he locked himself inside his palace and refused to emerge. The shame of Las Navas de Tolosa had broken something inside him. He had lost not only an army, but his honour and his purpose and his claim to divine favour. Within a year, he was dead. Some chronicles say illness took him, and others whisper of darker possibilities, but what killed him matters less than what his death meant for the empire he left behind. The Almohad Caliphate had been the most powerful Muslim state in the Western world, and now it began to crack apart as rival factions fought for control of a throne that no longer commanded respect. Across Europe, the bells rang in celebration. Pope Innocent III received the Caliph's standard and declared Alfonso VIII a champion of Christendom, a warrior who had turned back the tide of Islam and secured the future of Catholic Spain. Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, who had travelled to Rome to beg for help and then marched south to fight alongside his king, was celebrated as a hero of the faith. The Christian kingdoms of Iberia had accomplished something that no one had believed possible. They had united against a common enemy and destroyed him utterly. Alfonso VIII lived only 2 more years. He died in October of 1214 at the age of 59, worn out by decades of war and worry. But he died knowing that the work of his life was complete. the wound of Alarcos had been healed. The shame had been washed away in Almohad blood, and the road to the south lay open. The work that Alfonso VIII began was finished by his descendants. His grandson Ferdinand III inherited the throne of Castile in 1217 and 3 years later united it with Leon to create a kingdom powerful enough to crush what remained of Almohad Spain. Ferdinand was a different kind of warrior than his grandfather, methodical where Alfonso had been passionate, patient where Alfonso had been impulsive, but he shared the old king's vision of a Christian Iberia, and he pursued it with relentless determination. In 1236 he captured Córdoba, the city that had once been the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, and the greatest centre of Islamic learning in the Western world. The great mosque where generations of Muslims had prayed was consecrated as a cathedral, and the bells that had been carried south as trophies centuries before were returned to their Christian homes. 10 years later, Jaén fell after a long siege, and then, in 1248, Ferdinand achieved the greatest conquest of all. Seville, the jewel of Andalusia and the former capital of Almohad Spain, surrendered after a brutal siege that lasted over a year. Ferdinand had ships dragged overland to blockade the river, and he starved the city until its defenders had no choice but to submit. The entire Guadalquivir Valley, the agricultural heartland of Muslim Spain, passed into Christian hands. Ferdinand died in 1252 while planning an invasion of North Africa itself, dreaming of carrying the war across the strait to the homeland of the Almohads, and the Church later canonized him as Saint Ferdinand for his services to the faith. The Almohad Empire did not survive much longer than the Caliph, who had fled Las Navas de Tolosa. By the 1260s, it had collapsed entirely, torn apart by civil wars and tribal rivalries, and new dynasties rose in Morocco to take its place. The Marinids crossed the strait in the 14th century, hoping to reverse the tide and reclaim Al-Andalus for Islam, but they were crushed at the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340 and never threatened Spain again. By that time, only one Muslim kingdom remained on the Iberian Peninsula. Granada, nestled in the mountains of the south, survived for 280 years by paying tribute to Castile and playing its Christian neighbours against each other. Its rulers built the Alhambra, one of the most beautiful palaces in the world, and presided over a final flowering of Moorish culture while the noose slowly tightened around them. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who had united Aragon and Castile through marriage, finally finished what Alfonso VIII had started. Their armies besieged Granada through the winter, and on January 2nd, the last Muslim ruler surrendered the keys to the city and rode into exile. The reconquista was complete. 781 years after the first Muslim armies had crossed from Africa, Spain was Christian again. That same year, Ferdinand and Isabella sponsored a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who sailed west across the Atlantic and stumbled upon a new world. The unified Catholic kingdom that emerged from the Reconquista would go on to build the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it all began on a sun-baked plain in the Sierra Morena, where 3 kings and a shepherd changed the course of history. Today, a monument stands near the battlefield showing Alfonso VIII and Pedro II and Sancho VII, with the mysterious Martín Alhaja pointing the way through the mountains. The wind still blows across that plateau, and the hills are still brown and dry in summer, just as they were on that July morning in 1212. Most travellers on the highway that now runs through the Despeñaperros Pass do not stop to read the markers or visit the small museum that preserves relics from the battle, but the echo of that day has never faded. It lives in the chains on the flag of Navarre and in the cathedrals that rose where mosques once stood, and in the very name of the pass itself. Despeñaperros, the overthrow of the dogs, one battle, one shepherd's secret, and the entire future of Spain was written in blood.